What we want to cover in this particular segment is transportation, refining, and marketing of crude oil and oil products. And to assist in our doing that, my friend Wayne Dawson is here to explain all that for us. Wayne is retired from Shell Oil Company, where he ran a refinery in California. How long did you run that refinery, Wayne?
Oh, depending on where it was, 7, 8, 9 years.
Yeah.
In operations of the plant.
Yeah. But what our discussion today, we're going to essentially take things from the oil fields with the transportation of crude to the refinery, and then the transportation of products and the ultimate marketing of those products. So we can start out with the where we're getting the oil from.
Yeah, I'd like to take a brief look at where we get it from and talk about some of the difficulties of getting it here. U.S. production is about 11 million barrels a day, and if you'd looked at that chart 2 or 3 years ago, U.S. would have hardly made it onto the chart. Their production has just increased astronomically. And so now we're tied with Saudi and Russia in the amount we export, the amount of oil we produce. And then Canada, of course, and Iraq come in there. And if you notice that 3 of those countries are not exactly terribly good friends of ours. They vacillate back and forth, particularly Saudi. And so you get a lot of production that, a lot of their production goes to places other than the United States, because China is a voracious consumer of oil now.
Now, the substantial increase in U.S. production, is that primarily attributed to hydraulic fracturing technology?
A little bit of everything, and a lot of the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, Wyoming, Manitoba, and up into Canada, which they don't even know how big that formation is yet. And it's being produced. If you've driven through North Dakota, sometimes you can hardly get a motel room because the oil boom is going so much. But fracking and tertiary recovery, steam, helium, CO2, all those methods have greatly increased the production in the United States, particularly from some of the older fields.
Mm-hmm. I've often thought that it's interesting to me that when we're looking at tertiary production or tertiary recovery, and this is just a ways of upgrading the fields, is that a lot of places are using carbon dioxide.
Yep.
And you look at the efforts to get carbon dioxide out of the system, and people are actually producing carbon dioxide to pump into the fields. And honestly, you can see in terms of potential environmental issues, if you get the carbon dioxide leaking into the groundwater supply, worst thing that's going to happen, you're going to produce club soda.
Yep. So you don't have to mix your drink with anything but tap water. But then OPEC, everybody's heard of OPEC, and usually nobody knows what it is. Those are the countries that are actually involved in OPEC. Saudi Arabia being the big guy. They sort of swing all the production. When you hear that OPEC is going to cut back, that's usually Saudi going to cut back. And it's also a flag that some of those small countries will cheat and increase instead of cutting back. They'll try and help make up their profitability. But as you can see, not all of those are always on the U.S. side in a pinch. And if you remember the '72 oil embargo, that's the group that cut us off. And in those days, we were terribly dependent upon OPEC. And so we had long lines at the gas station, and I'm sure you remember that fist fights at the gas pump. And
only people that are our age
remember that. I understand.
That.
Your students won't. But the other thing that when you get into is oil reserves are a really controversial subject. because they don't all calculate them the same way. And so you can take some of these numbers with a grain of salt as to whose reserves are where.
Yeah.
The U.S. has a very rigorous method, and any company who sells their stock on the U.S. stock exchange is regulated by the SEC, and they have very rigorous rules.
Yes.
Australia, one of the companies a few years ago, they tried to boost their bonuses by booking reserves they didn't have.
Yeah. Well, I think that, and we do have a slide later on that we can talk about that. And the imports is an interesting image that we have here, looking at 2018, where we were importing almost 10 million barrels a day, while at the same time exporting 7.6 million barrels per day. But I think that 2 years ago, the net imports was 2.3 million barrels a day, and where are we today?
We're less than that.
Yeah.
It's very hard to figure out, mainly because 2019 is the only information that's available, because you don't have 2020, but 2019 isn't even complete.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't published it all. And interestingly, if you're ever looking for crude oil data, the OPEC website is much easier to understand than the U.S. websites. I usually go there to find some of the generic curves as to who's doing what, because they're very clear. They're made for some of us who don't speak crude oil. And but the news media has talked about us being completely balanced, although I could not prove that with any monthly data. So it must have been a short-term time. But I believe in another couple of years we will be.
Yeah.
And the exporting, it's a matter of trading crude and things like that, because it's located where we can't use it and somebody else can, and so we trade crude back and forth.
Yeah. This image that we have now on the top 5 countries of U.S. imports, is this slide based on the amount that we're importing from
Yes.
each one? So
Yes.
we get most of the oil from Canada.
We are getting now, in the last year or two, more oil from Canada than some of the others. Saudi probably runs them a close second, and in many months they're ahead of Canada. But if the Keystone's built, Canada will be way up, and the rest of them will be way down there. Mexico, it's a little harder to quantify what they're doing because the data's not readily available. Venezuela has assets in the United States that run that crude, and so they're not going to cut us off too quickly, or at least below the amount that those assets of theirs run, if in the end. And then Iraq, who knows what they're going to do.
Yeah, so in other words, what we're saying is that despite of any political differences that we might have with Venezuela, and whether or not we want to support the government by importing Venezuelan crude,
Yep.
the fact of the matter is that Venezuela would separately own some of the refineries.
Yep.
And so it's that we need to get that crude to.
And Saudi owns some also, and so they're not going to want to cut down below. If they want to say we're going to cut off the U.S., then they would cut their own throats, because they make a lot of money off of their assets in the United States, as does.
Yeah. Now, is that true throughout the world? Let's say the refineries on the Pacific Rim?
I would bet. Saudi, particularly with Saudi, as I said earlier, a lot of people think those are a bunch of uneducated desert dwellers, and they're not. The OPEC system is run by very well-educated, very astute businessmen, and they're not going to cut their own throat. And Saudi particularly has been trying to diversify. And one of the ways they can do that is invest this huge amount of money in refineries somewhere else that can run their crude. I don't know where they're buying or if they're buying, because they're pretty secretive about that kind of stuff. But I do know that Venezuela owns assets in the United States, and so does Saudi.
And we're talking about here on the transportation, how it gets from one place to the next.
Yep. When you talk about Saudi and Venezuela and Iraq, they're not exactly next door to us. And so these very large crude carriers and ultra-large crude carriers bring it from overseas, particularly from Saudi and the Middle East. They are VLCC, the very largest, the smaller of the two. It's about 2.4 million barrels. The ultra-large can have about 4 million barrels, and a barrel is 42 gallons of oil. And so that's a lot of oil in one of those ships. They cannot get into hardly any ports in the United States.
And we can show some of those. And I think that, yeah, here's your image here that we're talking about 4 million barrels of crude on your ultra-large crude carriers and 2.2 million for the very large crude carriers. And here's the image of the ultra-large crude carrier. What sort of specs are we looking at for this ship?
That one right there is about 1,500 feet long. I forget how wide, 190 feet, I think, and 110 feet deep. And when you're talking about, the one I know about is the Houston Ship Channel, is only 40 feet deep. These don't get in there. And in fact, most of the ports these come into are offshore offloading facilities where they're very close to shore, and then they have a short pipeline to get it into shore to where they have storage facilities and ship it out to the various refineries. But they offload as quickly as they can, because having one of those tied up in a dock unloading is a very expensive proposition.
I can imagine.
And so those don't ever come very far into U.S. ports.
And so here's our very large crude carrier. And what sort of specifications do we have on this ship?
They're almost as long. They're a little shallower, but it doesn't take very much of a difference in dimension to make 1 million barrels. And so they're almost as big as the ULCCs, dimensionally.
Yeah, and the draft on that one is?
This one here is about 100 feet. But you can imagine standing on one end of that, and it's like 5 football fields long. And so, and they offload as fast as they can, but you're limited on how fast that is, because you can't have 80-inch pipelines.
But some of the important things about these ships too, that you have mentioned to me before, is you have a double hull.
Oh yes,
on them.
That's for protection against oil spills. After the Exxon Valdez, I think, is probably the driving force. These all went to double hulls to protect them from oil spills if they ran aground or something.
How are they protected inside? Do they have separate containers?
Yes.
Inside?
Yep, they're bulkheads in between them. And they've done as much as they can to protect against 4 million barrels of oil put out in the ocean someplace.
Yeah.
Because it would be hard to puncture that hole.
Yeah. And here we have the also some general purpose long range ships. Now is this the type of ship that you could get into the Houston Channel?
No.
Okay.
Most of those sit outside, and then they'll bring 70, 80,000 barrels with them. I don't remember getting any in Houston that were 600,000 barrels. That's usually from carrying from much further ports away, not the Middle East, but from Venezuela, for instance. But Houston Ship Channel is only 40 foot deep, and that allows you about a 36-foot draft ship. So they sit offshore and do what they call lightering, which they pump their crude, and actually some of these are product ships, although not very often, but they pump it into barges, and the barges come up and unload in the various refineries. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people don't like that very well, because anytime you have pumping over water, you always have a risk of a leaky hose. But lightering is the process they use to get crude up into some of these ports like Houston.
Now the ships coming from let's say Mexico or Venezuela, would we be using these long-range ships or something?
Venezuela usually ships in long-range planes. They're bigger, but not in the realm of VLCCs. They're the ships, I think, probably at one time were the huge ships. Everybody thought they were big until they decided to build one of 2.4 million barrels.
Yeah. And probably none of these ships can get through the Panama Canal, can they?
Some of the general purpose and long range are small enough to get through the Panama Canal, but remember, they just widened the canal. And one of the reasons was to try and get some of these larger ships through there. And I don't remember the size limitation on the Panama Canal, but they try and avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah.
And of course, lots of Venezuelans will come up on the same side of the world that the refineries are at, so
Sure.
into Texas. And, most of them don't come into California. People don't like going into California with crude.
Yeah. All right, well, let's talk about pipelines.
Okay.
Now, obviously, this is if you're delivering over land,
This is the way to go.
Pipelines are what we would be using. And I mean, is there a substantial network of European pipelines? I mean, you hear a lot
Yes.
about the gas pipelines that.
Not as well. Russia is a big producer of crude too, so they pump it out. But their largest one is 1.4 million barrels a day, and the largest U.S. pipelines, which get to be 30 inches in diameter, are all natural gas, which is either a byproduct of refining, or they've found lots of major fields of natural gas. Right now, natural gas is a glut on the market. I know of a couple of liquefied natural gas plants in various parts of the United States that are teetering on the decision of what they think the long-term forecast of natural gas is going to be in price in order to decide whether they can afford to liquefy it and then ship it overseas, because it usually goes to.
Is it a substantially costly process to liquefy natural gas?
The plant in Pennsylvania that I've read about is $7 billion. And so it's not a casual decision that a company makes. And depends on what you think the supply of natural gas is, which right now, like I say, is a glut on the market, and what its price will be, and can you afford to liquefy it in the U.S. where it's a surplus and ship it to China or someplace like that where it's needed. And there are lots of environmental negatives to liquefied natural gas plants because if it ever gets away from you, then you could have a fairly major explosion.
Yeah. So so the problem really, from an environmental standpoint, is the potential for an explosion.
Explosion.
Yeah.
And because it's liquid, it blevies, which is boiling liquid, expanding vapor explosion, which is much worse than just boom.
Oh, okay.
And then the Keystone, which has been in the news, seems like for years, ultimately will carry 1.1 million barrels a day from Canada to the U.S. And it also picks up a lot of oil in the northern states, around the Dakotas and in there.
Bringing that south.
Bringing it south.
Now, a lot of the objections to Keystone has been in the development of some of the heavier oil in Alberta. But do you know what percentage that might
No.
be?
In fact, almost all of it's a heavier oil and is dirty, and they have to take some of the stuff out, but it comes to the U.S. as dirtier, more corrosive crudes. And they have to be very careful with them to keep them from corroding out the pipelines and leaking. And that's part of the objection to it. Although.
So this is really a construction problem of the pipeline as to how best to avoid corrosion.
And treatment of the crude at the field, because crude comes out of the ground with water and salts and all kinds of nasty stuff. And they try and take as much of that out as they can at the field, because in a refinery, at every step in the process, from getting crude to the refinery, you take water out. If you get a slug of water into a crude unit, for instance, in a refinery, that crude unit is designed for oil vaporizing at 1 to something like 40 times volume. Water is something like 1 to 1400. So if you get a slug of water in there, it just tears all the trace out of the columns and does ugly things.
Now, at the field, we talk about taking the water and salt and things like that out of it. What sort of facilities would you have at the field to do that?
It depends on how exotic they want to be. It may be nothing but a tank, put the crude in, let it sit for a while, the water will settle out and you drain it out. Now you got to treat the water because it's really nasty stuff. But
could you pump that back down into the
if
formation?
EPA will allow you. The answer is yes. Technically, you can do that, and a lot of places do that. That's how they get rid of it when you don't have any water treatment facilities. But it's not always the
the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, and then there's another big pipeline that's up there that's 1.4 million. And so those are the size pipelines you're now hearing about. And of course, Keystone gets us all that oil down to Houston in that area. A lot of people, well, if we allow them to send it down there, we will never reduce our carbon footprint. Well, Canada is going to produce that oil whether we buy it or not. And I'd rather buy it from Canada than Saudi. And if we don't buy it, they're going to send it to China. Mm-hmm. And now that would be a heck of a pipeline, but they can get it there.
So they would really have to be a pipeline over to the west coast of Canada. So they're probably coming out of Vancouver.
Yeah.
Now, what the Enbridge
I don't know
pipeline.
a whole lot about that, except it collects a whole bunch of the various fields and brings it east to some of the terminals and refineries they have
on the east coast.
Yeah.
Well, and here we have an illustration of what the various pipelines look like in the United States.
Yeah, it's a maze of pipelines. If you'll notice that there's a huge accumulation of pipelines in and around the Texas area. Lots of those are very old.
Yeah, this is what we're talking about here with all the areas down around.
Lots of those are old, and they're like 4 inches in diameter, maybe 6 inches in diameter, whereas modern pipeline would probably never be less than 8 or 10 or 12. Mm-hmm. And there are just a lot of them there, and you can hardly get around Texas without running across a pipeline.
Well, the major pipeline from Los Angeles through the area where we are and comes right through here. Now, does that go to Houston?
Okay. Well, you should have stopped in Arizona. There's a pipeline that comes from Houston.
Oh, there's a
actually from El Paso.
Okay, so
and it stops in Arizona, and the California one comes to Arizona and stops in Arizona.
Okay, so we got another coming down through here, stopping.
Texas can't make California reformulated gasoline without major changes in their processing units. California, when they legislated reformulated gasoline, took the national standards for sulfur and nitrogen, all those things that cause smog, and divided the national standards by 10, and then legislated that as California reformulated gasoline. And they were told it was going to cost a lot more money to buy it at the pump, and then sort of forgot it 5 years later when they had to pay more money at the pump. But Arizona has a spec that's somewhat less than California but more than national. But it only applies around the Phoenix area. And so I assume there are plants in Texas that will manufacture Arizona gasoline, because that's where it's going. It's coming in that there's a pair of pipelines that come over there, and then California, of course, sends it over. And Tucson, I think, gets most of its gasoline from California. I have never been able to get anybody to admit that what we get is California reformulated gasoline, but I don't know how it can be anything else.
Yeah. All right, well, this is our slide on some more transportation with the size of the railroads, tank cars, and trucks. You see a lot of tank cars on the interstates these days.
Yep, and there's, particularly if you go up in the north, the Dakotas
Along
and up in there.
I-40.
Yeah, there are lots of tank cars being, in fact, most of the Canadian oil is being shipped by rail because the pipeline isn't finished all the way yet.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch the money, you'll see who objects to the pipeline because they own the railroads.
Well,
but,
I think that's another point too, that when we look at the capacity of the rail cars carrying crude oil as opposed to carrying farm products.
Yep.
There are the economics of the production of corn and the price of tortillas. A lot of times is affected by
Oh, you bet.
the price, because you can't get the
Because you can't get the cars.
The cars.
Yeah, or you can't get space on the rail
Mm-hmm.
for the cars because crude probably gets precedent. When a freight train comes through full of crude cars, they probably take precedence over corn.
They're probably paying more for it. Now,
Yeah.
this is an interesting graphic that you produced for me.
Yeah.
Just essentially saying that what's the worst to best type of shipment
To say
based
worst,
on.
you have to define what you mean worst. And there's three different cases. Is it worst from death and property destruction? In that case, trucks are worst, trains are next, pipelines, and then ships. Ships don't have very much property damage and destruction, knock on wood so far. But when we were in Australia, when we see a gasoline truck here that's a tanker and one trailer, Australia has a tanker and 12 trailers.
Mm-hmm.
And they go through the outback, I guess, in the middle of those dirt roads and blowing up a dust cloud at about 75 or 80 miles an hour. You get out of their way. And I have to tell you, I didn't quite believe that until we were up on a hill with an overlook, and down below was a tanker refueling station, and there was a truck and 6 tankers there. And they said that's because he'd already dropped off some of his the tanks. And so if you talk about having one of those hit you, you're dead. Mm-hmm. And oil spilled, trucks are worse because they can...
you can spill your whole load.
It's pretty easy to spill. Ships are the least because of the least, but if you look at volumes, and that's comes into environmental impact, ships are worse if they ever spill it. The Exxon Valdez was 280,000 barrels spilled, and you'd have to spill a lot of trucks to be equivalent to.
Yeah, and that's a good point too that you raise on. Yeah, the Exxon Valdez, we say 280,000 barrels, as opposed to our ultra large crude carriers and very large crude carriers, and
about 4 million.
4 million barrels. And
yeah, if one of those ever sinks to where it had a big enough hole in it, but hopefully the compartments would have been closed, there'll be a massive, massive, massive oil spill.
Yeah.
And I don't care where you are in the world, the size of that oil spill, you'll foul a lot of beaches. Yeah. And you won't be able to clean all the ducks up with Dawn from that oil spill. In product transportation, it's a different ballgame somewhat.
Now when we're talking about product transportation, we mean the gasoline.
Gasoline and turbine fuel and that kind of stuff. We talked a little bit about it before. They don't use VLCCs, and I mean, it would take a long time to fill a VLCC with gasoline, and you're not shipping them over the distance that make those big carriers economical. So most of it comes with smaller ships. It comes in by pipeline. I know there's a 12-inch pipeline in Louisiana that operates at 900 PSIG. Remember, your tire is 30, so this is 900 psi-G.
Well,
Gasoline,
now that's pounds per square inch.
yes, pounds per square inch gauge.
Oh, gauge, okay. Got to get that last G
That's
in
the
there.
G. And pipelines are, if the market's big enough, the pipeline takes the gas from the refinery to the terminal outside of town. And then from the terminal, well, you can get rail cars coming in too. It depends on the size of your market.
Mhm.
But from the terminal, then trucks deliver it to the station.
Now you hear in situations in Mexico, for example, where you have people that are trying to siphon gas or get gas out of the pipelines, or
That's not all in Mexico, by the way.
yeah, what would the PSI be for that type of a
Well,
pipeline?
there have been occasions where somebody tried to hot tap one of these high pressure lines and sort of blew up in their face because the stuff they were tying into wasn't equipped for that kind of pressure. But and pipeliners are very, very sophisticated guys. They have very exacting instrumentation on their pipeline. And unless they're taking off just minute quantities, if it's very big, they can tell it's being stolen. And plus the fact they patrol the pipeline all the time. But every now and then, I hadn't heard of this in several years, but they'll try and weld a connection on with a valve and then hot tap through the pipe, and then pipe that gasoline off to their tank, farmer in the field. And that used to be in the low pressure, old fashioned lines where they weren't very high pressure. You don't ever want to do that in one of these high pressure lines like the line to Louisiana, in Louisiana, because the chances are of a person who's willing to steal small amounts of gas being technologically savvy enough to keep from blowing himself up, it's probably not a.
Yeah. So
In Mexico, they probably have lower pressure pipelines, though. I doubt if they've got too many that operate at 900 psi-G.
okay. So it's 900 pounds per square inch, and so that's going to cause a significant eruption.
Yeah, and you have to have a qualified welder to weld it on. You have to have a hot tap machine that's capable of handling that kind of pressure. So
Yeah.
it's not a good thing to be doing.
So if you're going to steal things, you're better off to hijack a truck. Huh?
Yes, yeah, you bet, or a rail car.
Yeah. But
again,
I think that we've done this one already.
Crude doesn't do you any good unless you can refine it into usable products. There are 135 in the United States. The last one built was in 1977, and the forecast now is that there'll never be another one built in the United States because people don't want it in their backyard. It's an NIMBY circumstances, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
And the U.S.'s largest is 645,000 barrels a day of crude. It runs that much crude. The world's largest is 1.4, and it's somewhere on the Pacific Rim, and I don't remember exactly what country it's in.
Where is the U.S. largest?
It's in Louisiana.
Okay.
And our smallest is 190 barrels a day in Wyoming. Now there's a group of people in the U.S. The major oil companies don't like oil wells that produce only a little bit at a time. So as the field dies, these oil wells only produce a little. And they'll sell them off. And we had people in Texas that would buy those in a minute. And if you can go out and service it yourself. I mean, I had friends who had the technical savvy to go out and service the pumps and do all that. And they just pump it into a little tank. And every now and then they get a truck in and they unload the tank into the truck and take it over and sell it as crude. Mm-hmm. But it's too small for a major oil company to be able to screw around with.
Now I assume that these largest refineries are probably several $1 billion to put together.
645,000 would probably be 10 or 20 billion
Yeah.
or more. Depends on what you want to do with what kind of a product mix you make. Because refineries take crude, and you're limited to what's in the molecules that are in crude, because there isn't enough stuff in there, which is called straight run products. There isn't enough straight run stuff to supply all the demand in the U.S. for all the products we make. And so they either break the molecule apart or put them together or add hydrogen. And so you get, when we look at the refinery here in a minute, I'll show you some of those that
All right.
that do things to the molecule that that's a small piece of one refinery. And that right there is probably $5 or $10 billion.
Wow.
Refineries are very expensive to build. And there is lots of objection to them across the country just from political aspect, not in my backyard.
But is it the refinery itself is not going to be polluting, is it?
Can.
Okay.
I don't want to live by one.
Okay.
There's lots of bad stuff in crude. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll do it anyway. Hydrogen sulfide comes in crude. There's lots of sulfur in crude in various forms. And when you get those, eventually it all comes out as hydrogen sulfide. And most of the chemistry students from high school have all made rotten egg gas. That's hydrogen sulfide. It's an extremely dangerous product because it's probably the one gas I know of that if it leaks out into the atmosphere, you'll smell it right away.
Smell it immediately.
But in higher concentrations, you quit smelling it. And so people think it went away. And we've had instances in refineries where people know they have a hydrogen sulfide leak, and then it goes away, and so they run in to get it, and they're down. We've had as many as 3 different people go in after each other before they realize that it's a really high concentration H2S leak. Sulfide is hydrogen sulfide is one of the ones that we lecture operators on a lot.
Now, can you take H2S and refine it into
the answer is yes.
sulfide
The end
hydrogen?
product of hydrogen sulfide is sulfur.
Okay.
And most refineries make sulfur. That goes to the sulfur dioxide.
And what about the hydrogen?
Well, hydrogen is, you can do all kinds of things with it. Put it back in the process or whatever you do with it.
Yeah. Because
or you burn
right
it.
now the hydrogen is the production of hydrogen is really very costly.
Yes, it is.
And so by having it part of an oil refinery, it would fit right into the system.
Every oil refinery of any size has a hydrogen plant, at least 1 or 2, to make hydrogen. But the crude products, the stuff that's in crude are separated by their boiling points. If you talk about lightest stuff, you get methane, then you get ethane, propane, butane, pentane, and then you get into the gasoline range. And then you get jet fuel, then diesel, fuel oil, and the bottom of the barrel is either asphalt or crude or coke. And coke is actually solid looking stuff like coke.
And you use that in a lot of
ship
power
it.
plants. And
You ship it overseas where they can burn it
okay.
because it's usually got a lot of sulfur in it.
And some of the really old smelters that when I was growing up, there was a coking plant that, some of the smelters use coke for the fuel.
Yep. They typically nowadays they don't because sulfur content is so high.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same problem with coal. There's so many of them have high sulfur content, they can't burn them here anymore.
Okay. So basically, when it comes into the refinery, you sort of split it off between your.
And I'll show you where that's done in a minute.
All right.
But it's done by boiling point. Here are the kind of products that you can get off of a barrel of gasoline.
Or a barrel of crude.
A barrel of crude. You have sulfur low sulfur distillates, which is what diesel and some of those they have. You have jet fuel, you have gasoline, and that black bottom on that barrel is ugly stuff. You have to do something really ugly with it.
Well, the interesting thing to me about this slide was the fact that looking at the gasoline and the your diesel looks about the same, isn't it? About equal.
It all
Equal
depends on what you want it to be.
All right.
That's a typical one, and I'll show you in the refinery slide what you do to get away from that.
All right.
You have to, when you build a refinery, you have to know the crude that you're going to get, and you have to know the product slate that you want to make. That determines what units in a refinery there are, and you can change that a lot if you want to.
Let's talk about some of the other products.
And then
might
you
be
get
able to
other
out.
products that I always, during the oil embargo, it was really funny because you talked about what is going to go away if gasoline goes away, and you find out that plastics, and there's football helmets, there's football cleats, your shirt, if it's nylon, will go away. All kinds of pharmaceuticals go away. In fact, the one that the news media used to use in the oil embargo is birth control pill shortage, because it was made out of, ultimately, some of the components were out of crude. And so there are all kinds of products you can make from oil, but not generally in an oil refinery. The refinery ships those various, what might be a gasoline component, maybe to Lubrizol, they can make a chemical out of it, and it's worth a whole lot more as chemical feedstock than it is as gasoline. And so you can, depends on where you are, where there are companion places that want your product, and you can make all kinds of things.
Obviously, here's a product that they don't want with the natural gas.
I wanted to show this slide because people misunderstand what that is a lot when they drive down the road. Every refinery has a flare, at least one. And the fact that it's burning like that doesn't mean that the refinery's on fire. I went to a fire at the refinery one time that all the way out there, in fact, I didn't know whether I wanted to go or not, because I kept hearing this news reporter on the corner, the refinery is in flames 300 feet in the air. And I thought, oh boy, this is a Jim Dandy. And when I got out there and tipped over the hill, could see the refinery, I knew where the fire was, and you could see a little shiny off the insulation. But the flare was going 300 feet in the air. And then it realized what she was reporting, scaring the heck out of the community, that the refinery was in flames 300 feet in the air, and it wasn't. That's where it goes. When you're having trouble in the unit and you need to get it depressured real quickly, you dump it to the flare, and the flare is a scientifically designed thing that burns at huge quantities fast.
So this really isn't a natural gas escape.
No, it is. Not usually. In Saudi it is. Saudi, now they're changing that because they've realized that they're burning an awful lot of money up that flare if they're a natural gas flare. But there are places where they probably have a small amount of natural gas that has to be gotten rid of, and not enough to make it into something else, and they'll burn it in a flare.
Right.
But it scares people. And of course, the same, when I got out the refinery, here was a dad and his two sons glued to the chain link fence directly opposite the flare. I thought, well, that's a guy who's really scared of it. May I have the tablet for this one?
Yeah, let's talk about this simplified refinery.
This is a simple one.
Okay, well we have a simplified refinery flow diagram, and obviously simplified in the context is not that simple. But let's start with the crude coming in to the plant.
Okay, this is crude coming in. It usually comes into one single column, and it's separated out by its various components by boiling point. The bottom of this, which is heavy oil, will go into another column where they distill it off under vacuum, because you can do that under lower temperature. And so you get two columns usually in a crude unit. The top of it usually is very sour, which means it's got a lot of sulfur, H2S in it. And the end product will be sulfur, which is what you asked about. That goes off, you sell that to sulfuric acid plants. That's what its market. The gasoline stuff, which are all these streams here, goes into the gasoline blender, which is this. And they determine the grade of gasoline they're going to blend, and that determines which of these various streams go into the gasoline, whether it's regular, intermediate octane, or premium. Then you have all these other units that take some of the bad stuff. They either break the molecule apart to make a good product, or they put it together, or they jam hydrogen into it. This one right here puts hydrogen in and removes the sulfur, removes all the bad stuff, and makes it a product that you can use.
So then it comes, I mean, that one then comes over and is a separate product on your line on the right-hand side.
Only this one, particular one here, is removing all the stuff out of that cut off the crude unit that would poison the catalyst in this one. That catalyst right there is probably platinum. Your students aren't old enough to remember the old platformate ads where a guy drives through a barrier, a paper barrier, and that's platformate. That's what that is. It's a very high octane, no longer made because it contained benzene, and benzene's a bad guy. And so you have, let's go to the next one.
All right, there's your next one.
Now this one has some stuff that's worth talking about. Crude oil comes in, which is this, and the stuff that's in it is removed in the desalter. That takes salt and water out. The water is nasty stuff. It has to be treated further before it can go out into the bay or into whatever body of water you're on. Then you send that into atmospheric distillation. The bottom of it is then sent in, the heavy part of that is then sent into vacuum distillation, where you can distill it under lower temperatures.
Now, when you say atmospheric distillation, that's you're just evaporating material.
Yes, this is maybe 35 pounds. This is probably minus 10 inches of mercury. It's a vacuum.
Okay.
And then everything downstream of that depends on the product distribution you want to end up with. And there are all kinds of these things. This one takes small molecules and puts it together to make a product. This one changes the molecule a lot.
Yeah, I won't have you pronounce those just as.
Polymerization, alkylation, catalytic reformer is this one. And these basically all are doing something to the molecule to make it usable. Cat cracking, this is where you circulate tons and tons and tons of catalyst that flows, and it's like sand. And almost every refinery has one. Then if you get down to coking, that unit right there is the thing that takes a heavy oil, beats the tar out of it, and makes a nice product, but the end product is coal, is the coke product, which is solid. And then it's cut out, literally by high pressure water, out of the reactor, and is sent overseas for fuel.
Yeah, and that's whenever you hear the term coking coal, then that's essentially not necessarily an artificial coal, but it's a coal that's produced out of oil and gas.
Out of oil, yeah.
Yeah.
When you build a modern refinery, you have to know your product distribution, and that's what this is. Most refineries are designed to make gasoline. Jet fuel is sort of a byproduct. Diesel is a byproduct. Asphalt and heavy fuel are definitely byproducts because there's not a lot of market for those. And then you get the hundreds of lesser known products that are made from all those various streams that I put X's on in that other drawing. Depends on what the properties of those are and who wants to buy them.
Now, over the past several years, there's been a push for diesel engines. Is that, and a lot of it is based on, or it's sold based on the fact that diesel fuel, at least at that time, cost less than gasoline.
I wish I had put, you're going to see a slide in a minute on taxes. I didn't put the diesel taxes on there. Diesel taxes are higher than gasoline. If you make diesel that has to meet a very high spec, which is what happens nowadays, this has to be low sulfur diesel, it gets to be expensive. Because you have to get rid of the bad stuff in it.
So today, in comparing gasoline engines with diesel engines, is what really is the
reason you're not seeing many, I think, is because diesel suddenly became a product instead of a byproduct.
okay.
It was something you had to have because it's there, and you wanted to dump it on the market. Well, once you decide, I want to run my engines on it and I want to put a high spec on it, now it becomes a product with a high spec and the cost goes up.
And the typical image of a diesel engine is something that's spouting lots of black smoke.
Absolutely. And you know, it used to irritate the tar out of me, drive down the street and have some guy in front of me belch a big black cloud of smoke because he's burning diesel.
Yeah, and that's because of the sulfur has not been taken out
Well,
of it.
it's a lot of things. Usually a poorly tuned engine needing attention. The sulfur isn't usually an issue nowadays because it's been taken out. You're not allowed to sell it with a lot of sulfur in it. It's usually a poorly tuned engine.
All right, let's talk about marketing. And
that's the big product is gasoline, and that's what it's all for. This is how Tucson and Phoenix get their gasoline. There's a 20-inch pipeline from LA to Phoenix. That's the one that I'm pretty sure brings California reformulated gasoline, since refineries don't change their operation just for Arizona.
and so that would all be coming from a California refinery.
Yeah,
And
because
the
those
California
pipelines
refinery has to meet the California specs.
and they can blend separately. What I'd worry about is if they've got an off-spec California gas, they can put it in this tank over here and sell it to Arizona because it meets their spec. But I would be surprised if they do that very often.
Okay.
And that's 60% of our gasoline comes from California. And then the east line, which is an 8-inch and a 12-inch, comes to Tucson, and then a single 12 to Phoenix. And they have to, if it goes to Phoenix, they have to go ahead and meet Arizona specs, because that Arizona spec is around the Phoenix area, not Tucson.
Okay.
And Arizona has a strict smog formation than the national. It's stricter than the national, but it is not as strict as California. And it's nitrogen, sulfur. Benzene is a bad guy. Benzene used to be sold as a solvent to wash your clothes in because it gets oil out, and it also causes cancer. So, and it also is a very bad smog performer.
Yeah. So the gasoline that's coming in to Phoenix is much closer to the California specifications.
Sort of in between.
As opposed to the gasoline that's coming into Tucson.
Right.
Where that would be more the national standards.
Either that, if it bypasses Phoenix, it can come on to Tucson. That's still California reformulated gasoline.
Would that mean there's a difference in the price between Phoenix and Tucson?
Probably. I've never priced the difference because I try and avoid buying gas in Phoenix. But it generally would mean when you have higher specs on a gasoline, it costs more money. And this is illustration of why gasoline costs more when you cross the state line, particularly California. Federal tax is all the same across the United States. Arizona's is 37.4 cents a gallon. California's is 69 cents a gallon. And New York State is the highest in the country at 69.6. So anytime our politicians want to lower the price of gasoline, they just have to cut the...
Yeah, it's primarily the taxes that are imposed on it.
Yeah.
But the thing that struck me about this is even though New York's the highest in the nation, it's not that much higher than California.
Nope. But, and then two things in gasoline when you buy it at the station that are important to the consumer. One is octane number and the other is detergent qualities of the gasoline. Does it take all the bad stuff that forms in your engine out? And octane number, people are usually pretty familiar with. When they buy it at the pump, there's 3 different pumps you can get it from. Octane number is a resistance to the detonation in a cylinder. If you're using too low an octane, when you put your foot on the gasoline, on the accelerator a lot, and start up quickly, if you could hear it go start to ping or to knock, you're using too low a gasoline octane number. The thing a consumer needs is to read his owner's manual, and they'll tell you what octane number to use, and if you use higher than that, you're wasting money. But if your car is knocking once in a while in the blue moon when you push the accelerator real hard, you don't need to go up. If it's knocking all the time, you need to go up.
Yeah, and what people don't think about sometimes when you think about Union 76, that wasn't based on the 1776,
Yep.
but the 76 octane rating.
76 octane number. Yep.
So if you were to put 76, actual 76 in your car today,
you probably couldn't run the car.
yeah,
It would probably coke the engine up so quickly that, because 76 also didn't have detergent stuff in it. And the other thing is top tier gasolines, which most people don't pay any attention to. All your majors, if you buy Shell, Exxon, Chevron, any of those, they're top tier gasoline by the company edict. That's all they make. If you get other brands, you have to look at the pump, and that logo there will be on the pump, or it'll say top tier gasoline.
and so the top tier really refers to having the detergent.
Having the amount of detergent in the gasoline. And the contract with the top tier organization specifies the minimum detergents you have to have in there.
Yeah, and this is the effect.
Now, AAA did a study to see if top tier is worth it or not, and this is an illustration of the amount of fouling on your valve in your engine if top tier versus non-top tier, and they concluded it was well worth the extra money to keep your engine clean.
Yeah, and this image of these valves. This particular image was done after how much use?
4,000 miles. Not very much.
Yeah, and so it would just get worse from this particular point further.
Now some people advocate, okay, I'll run a top tier gasoline every now and then and clean it out, and if you could guess how often that has to be, fine. It depends on whether you want to run your car for 200,000 miles or 50,000 miles. You don't care so much if you're going to trade it in every year or two. If you're going to trade it in every 10 or 15 years, you probably care.
Well, how do you clean out your engine from this type of build-out?
If you're lucky, you can do it with gasoline. Otherwise, take it out and have a valve job.
Okay.
And that's big money.
So when you talk about a valve job in a car, that's really cleaning out.
That's taking the engine apart and cleaning the valve stem or putting new ones in and putting it back together. But if you've looked at a modern engine, you have to remove 500 little things before you get to the engine.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the transportation. And we spent a lot of time on ships uh, and trucks, perhaps. We haven't looked at pipeline transportation
No.
that much.
Pipeline, pipeline is an interesting subject because it's a very high-tech operation. People think, oh, you got one line coming into Tucson, so all the gasoline's the same. And that's not true. If you pump fast enough, the interface between two products isn't very much gas, isn't very much product. If you pump real slow, then the interface gets much, much bigger. And the pipeliners know exactly when the interface between two products come into town, and they'll route the pipeline into the lowest spec tank and then cut it out and put it into the high spec tank. There are some rules they follow of their own that this product doesn't ever follow that one, so that they don't get into having cross-contamination problems in the tanks. But major oil company gasoline isn't wildly different when it comes into town. The big change in major gasolines is the additive package they put in as they pump it out, and that's put in at the terminal, not at the refinery.
Now, looking at the pipelines themselves,
Yeah.
what sort of material is used to separate out the different types of products?
It depends. Nothing. Just pump fast enough. If they're really high spec, and this is particularly true in a lube oil or something like that, where you don't want any cross contamination between this product and this one, there's a thing called a pig, and it's either a round ball or a long thing that looks like a bullet. And when you switch, you're pumping this product, and when you want to start this product, you route it through the pig launcher and shoot that pig out, and that stays in between.
And that'll separate out.
That'll keep it separate because
products.
they're very tight to the pipeline on the diameter. And on the other end, when it gets there, it catches the pig and routes it into the right tank.
Yeah.
Those are really high spec products because pig launchers are expensive.
Yeah, and so you have to make sure that that pig didn't get caught anywhere either.
Yeah, and a lot of other things. But we had a guy one time that didn't depressure the pig catcher before he opened it up, and it shot the pig clear across the road and hit a tank.
Well, here's our transportation of the specific products.
Yeah.
And it's easy to imagine just the shipment of jet fuel and ship pipelines and trucks, and as you indicate, it's the same pipeline as the gasoline.
Yep.
Asphalt
Asphalt's a whole
seems like
different
something
animal.
very different.
That's a different pipeline. You won't pipeline that in a gasoline pipeline because it has to be kept hot, and you don't want to heat gasoline because you'd vaporize it. But you might need to keep that 180 degrees as it goes cross country. And as a result, that's hard to do if you're going very far. So generally, you only ship asphalt by pipeline between two close plants. If you have an asphalt plant down the road from your refinery, you ship it down there, and they can take it and process it further into these multi-grades of asphalt that the various users need.
Would you have to have separate furnaces along the pipeline there to maintain the heat?
No, if you have it very far, it's usually steam. And so when you see an insulated line running down there, you'll frequently see another insulated line running beside it. That's the steam line, which supplies, they take a copper or steel tubing and tape it and fasten it to the asphalt line, and then pump
And so
steam in.
that provides the heat
And that
for the
provides
line.
the heat. And that's why you don't have it very long, because you actually have two pipelines. The other way to do it is with electric tracing, but I don't like that very well. I never had very good success with it.
Well, we've
So anything else?
We've reached the end of this refining and transportation module, Wayne. Thank you very much for coming in.
You're welcome.
And providing some light to the mysteries of gasoline refinery and
Hopefully I
production.
didn't use too many trade words.
Well, you can always work those things out. So we'll have some questions for you that'll cover both the geology and the refining process, and we'll get to that immediately. So thanks again, Wayne.
You're welcome. Anytime.